Let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome to Accessing Medicaid Waivers, a training designed for individuals with brain injury and the personal and professional people who support them. This training is sponsored by the Disability Law Center of Virginia, which many of you know is Virginia's protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities, and certainly that includes individuals with brain injury. I am Elizabeth Horn, and I am joined by my colleague, Erin Haw. We are senior disability rights advocates at the Disability Law Center of Virginia, and we serve as subject matter experts in brain injury and waivers, respectively. We will be recording this training, which will be emailed to all the registrants, along with the PowerPoint presentation and an evaluation, which we ask that you take a few moments to complete. If you would like the material captioned and you activate that, you would activate it at the live transcript icon at the bottom of the screen and simply select Show Subtitles. We will also have, as you can see, live ASL interpreters throughout, who we encourage to jump in if you need us to repeat anything. And if you prefer not to see the live interpreter as the spotlighted featured person, then you simply go into gallery mode. Okay, we have allowed time for questions and answers, and we request that you put them into the chat box. A few of them we may be able to answer as we're talking, but probably most of them will get answered toward the end of the talk. So anyway, we generally hope by the end of this training that you will think of DLCV as a resource when it comes to Medicaid waivers. And now it's time to review our goals. Okay, so what are we going to learn today? First, we need you, of course, to know what Medicaid's waivers are and how can they help a person with a brain injury live in their home or in their community, as opposed perhaps to a more institutional setting. Now, this objective will include understanding the financial and the medical criteria for each waiver. Second, we will share the specific services and supports offered by each waiver. And third, we will tell you how to apply and also how to prepare for and answer the screening questions that will improve your chances of being approved. Our fourth objective is for you to understand how to document your brain injury so your limitations are well understood. And next, of course, if you're denied, we will explain to you your appeal rights. And last, we're going to share a multitude of resources that are available to you as you consider waivers and as you attempt to navigate waivers. And so there really are plenty of those, DLCV being one of them. Okay.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Elizabeth. Probably at the forefront of everyone's mind, especially if you're not already familiar, is what is a waiver? And that's certainly one of the most important things we want to help communicate and explain today in case this is new territory for you. So I think most people are probably familiar with Medicaid generally, right? Like Medicaid is a healthcare option that's typically used by like lower income families or by people who have disabilities and are receiving SSI benefits. And just general Medicaid pays for your doctor's appointments, your prescriptions, and things like that. Okay, and so Medicaid is a cost sharing program, meaning like the federal government puts some money towards it, and then the state also puts some money towards Medicaid. And so there's lots of federal rules and options that apply, even though our program is administered right here in Virginia. So one of the things that the federal government allows for is states to create what they call 1915C waivers. There's actually lots of types of waivers, but this is the one we're going to focus on today, the 1915C waivers. And those waivers offer an alternative to institutional care. So when somebody has a Medicaid waiver, when it's all working the way it's supposed to, the services you get kind of replicate what you would otherwise receive in an institutional setting. But instead of having to like live in a nursing home to get your skilled nursing needs met, your medication management needs met, you can stay in your own home or another community setting to get those services to come to you. So in Virginia right now, we have Medicaid waivers that offer an alternative to nursing facility level of care. So nursing home is probably like the more common term that people are familiar with. So we have an alternative to that level of care. And then we also have some Medicaid waivers that offer an alternative to intermediate care facility level of care. Not a lot of people are familiar with what that is, but for those of you who've been in Virginia for a while, you may have heard in the news or other sources that we have historically had a large number of what they call training centers in Virginia. So these were large institutions run by the state for people with developmental disabilities. Most of those training centers have closed now at this point, but the type of care offered in those institutional settings was considered ICF level of care. One of the limitations of Medicaid waivers is that they are state specific. So we're going to talk to you specifically about what's available in Virginia. But unfortunately, the waivers we have here in Virginia, if you were to move to another state, might not be available there. So every state has their own waiver programs. They all have different names. They all have different service options. And unfortunately, they don't move across state lines with people. So because this is a Medicaid affiliated program, there are financial considerations. However, they're slightly different than when an individual or a family applies for just general Medicaid coverage. So one of the beautiful things about Medicaid waivers is when you're being assessed for them, for the financial criteria, you as the potential waiver recipient are always considered what they call a family of one. So even though you may be a minor child and you live at home with your parents and your parents work and have different resources and things saved up, when the Medicaid assessment is being done for financial criteria, they're just going to look at you as the kiddo and see what you have to determine whether or not you're eligible, right? So most children are. Same for adults. If you are married and you work and your partner works, a lot of times that would disqualify you from being eligible for just general Medicaid healthcare coverage. But for the waiver, they're just going to look at you as the individual. And we do have some of the limits actually typed up on the screen here for you. One of the most important things to remember is that even if you have resources in excess of $2,000, as an individual with a disability, you may be able to tap into some special savings programs like special needs trusts, ABLE accounts, which allow you to continue to bring money in and to save money for your future needs and not put your financial eligibility at risk for your Medicaid waiver. So as I mentioned, Virginia has several Medicaid waivers currently. We have 4 of them. The first 3 actually have an umbrella term that they're often described by, and that's the developmental disability or DD waivers. So under that, we have the community living CL waiver, the family and individual supports FIS waiver, and the building independence BI waiver. And I know that last one is a little confusing because I think a lot of the folks on this call are probably used to BI as the acronym for brain injury. But in this case, it is a developmental disability waiver. So in this context specifically. So the 4th 1915C waiver that we have in Virginia is called the CCC plus waiver. And there's actually a large number of people in Virginia who still refer to this waiver under its former name. It was rebranded several years ago now, but sometimes you'll still hear people refer to it as the EDCD or Elderly and Disabled with Consumer Direction waiver. So if you see that in any literature or somebody mentions that to you, they are referring really to the CCC plus waiver. So we're going to jump in now to a deeper discussion around the 3 developmental disability waivers. And to have that discussion, especially to put it in context for people with brain injury, we're going to go through what the state in state code and state regulations has defined a developmental disability to be. So I apologize, this is a bit jargony and it's multi-pronged, but we tried to simplify it as best as we can. So a developmental disability, first and foremost, is either a physical or mental condition, or it can be both, that began before the age of 22, that's key. It has to be likely to continue indefinitely. It must require individualized services and supports that are long-term or lifelong in nature. And finally, it needs to result in a substantial functional limitation in 3 or more life areas. So physical or mental condition that starts before age 22, and importantly, you need to have at least 3 of these functional limitations to be considered in Virginia a person with a developmental disability. So some of the functional limitations involve things like communication, mobility, but even things like being able to financially support yourself or being able to live independently. They're all listed out here on the slide for you, which, as Elizabeth mentioned, we will send around to folks so they have it after the fact. So Elizabeth, I'm gonna kick it over to you now.
Thank you. So I'm sure the question here is for you all is, can a brain injury be a developmental disability? And the answer emphatically is yes, as long as the traumatic or acquired brain injury occurred before age 22, which Erin said was critical, and the individual otherwise meets the criteria for developmental disability. So it has to be a severe condition, a chronic condition, and result in these at least 3 functional limitations. The key thing here, though, is it has nothing to do with how old you are now. So you can have a developmental disability regardless of your current age. And I stress this because historically, we have discovered that lots of families that in fact have a loved one or the individual with a disability is in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, actually sustained their traumatic or acquired brain injury prior to the age of 22. And they have really maybe forgotten about that fact, and yet they qualify potentially for these services. So it's just very important that you do some retrospective thinking about if you're wondering if you might qualify for at least the DD waiver, if that injury or condition occurred prior to age 22. So we'll delve into that some more.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So under the DD waiver umbrella, as I mentioned, there are 3 separate Medicaid waivers. And I'm just going to touch on these briefly here. And again, we'll have links and things included in the PowerPoint, so you can do some additional study later on if you'd like. But the most comprehensive Medicaid waiver that we have in Virginia is called the Community Living, or the CL waiver. So both children and adults are eligible for this waiver. And it's the most comprehensive in that it offers everything from like residential, like out of home residential type of care to more integrated community services like on the job employment supports and things like that. So for people who need like 24-hour care or approaching 24-hour care and supervision, oftentimes the community living waiver is the one that's going to be best suited to their needs. And you don't have to live in an out of home, like group home type setting with this waiver, but that is one of the options that's available. A slight step down from that, just in terms of the number of services that are available, is the Family and Individual Supports waiver, the FIS waiver. This one is also open to both children and adults. So there's no age limits on this. The big thing for this waiver is you do need to be able to live typically with your family or live in your own like house or apartment to access this waiver. So it doesn't include the more congregate residential type of services. And this waiver typically also can be used to cover a lot of your day if you need like that one-on-one staffing support during the day and the evening, but it's not typically used for around-the-clock care. And finally is the building independence, the BI waiver. This waiver is only available to adults, and it's available to adults who are able to live pretty independently, so usually in their own home or an apartment, and they need periodic supports, but not constant supports, right? So maybe somebody needs to come in and help with some of their like personal care occasionally, or provide some services and supports around day activities or employment, but it's really the least intensive DD Medicaid waiver that we have in Virginia, and just for adults. I touched on this briefly, but we wanted to highlight again some of the specific services that are included in the DD waiver, just in case they seem relevant to you, a family member, or somebody that you're supporting in a professional capacity. So generally, as I said, the DD waivers have residential type supports, which can include that off-site congregate type of setting like a group home, but also much more progressive integrated approaches to supporting people in their housing. For example, shared living is one of the reimbursable services under this waiver. We have a service offering called sponsored residential, where an individual with a disability who qualifies for this waiver can live essentially with like a host family that's received licensing and training and background checks from the state, but it's a much more integrated model than having to go into like a congregate care setting. So lots of different home and residential options are available under these waivers. There's also lots of services and supports that just speak to like what we want to do during the day with our life. So people can get workplace assistance through these waivers if they want to obtain employment or maintain employment. Some people prefer to do less intensive like non-employment day activities. So there's day support offerings. One of the most important services that's newly available to people under the DD waiver is non-medical transportation, which is a game changer for a lot of folks. The state has been a little slow to roll it out, but it's gathering steam. And basically, this is a way for people to get their transportation to non-Medicaid services covered. So some of you guys might know that like a Medicaid beneficiary typically can get Medicaid to pay for their transportation to a doctor's appointment, but they're not going to get their transportation reimbursed through Medicaid for just like a social outing you want to go to. So there are some new options, thankfully, for non-medical types of transportation. Just a couple of important extras we wanted to highlight as well. Some people have ongoing nursing support needs. You can get private duty nursing through these Medicaid waivers. Some people have periodic or long-term like crisis support or behavioral support needs. So there's lots of reimbursement options and services there. And I definitely wanted to mention as well, benefits planning. This is a huge one. This is in relation to Social Security benefits. So people who have Social Security benefits and need to maintain their benefits and their Medicaid coverage, they can work with specially trained individuals to navigate the process of going back to work and starting to earn money again, and figure out like what rules apply and what sort of thresholds they need to stay under. So this is not a comprehensive list. In the notes section that we're going to send around to you, there'll be some links if you want to see exactly what services are offered under all of these waivers. It'll take you to some fact sheets. They're multiple pages long. There is a lot offered under the DD waivers. So If a DD waiver is sounding like something that might be helpful for you, a family member, or somebody you support, it's important to know about how the state formalizes the screening process for this waiver. As we said earlier, there is a pretty prescriptive definition about what qualifies as a developmental disability in Virginia. So the state has developed this screening tool. It's called the VIDES, the Virginia Individual Developmental Disability Eligibility Survey, which is a mouthful. The VIDES is the screening tool that's administered to see if people are eligible for the DD waiver. And it walks you through lots of different domains, which pretty closely mirror, honestly, the functional limitations that we were talking about earlier. So there's going to be a whole section on like behavior and self-direction, your medical status, things like that. And so this tool is seeing if you have a developmental disability, and also if you have a developmental disability that would qualify you essentially for ICF level of care, that intermediate care facility level of care. That's what this screening tool is looking at. There's two different versions of it. There's one that's designed for children, and there's one that's designed for adults. And we do have hyperlinks here as well that you can later, when you get this PowerPoint, click through if you want to see the full assessment tool. All right, Elizabeth, back to you.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, I've been thinking a lot about my tips, and these are born out of a lot of experience working with individuals trying to acquire Social Security benefits and how to get those cases documented, as well as individuals with brain injury and their support people who call the Disability Law Center, and we work with them on obtaining their waivers. And so we have figured out what doesn't help and what does help and where the gaps are. And we find this so important because, as we all know, in Virginia, there is no brain injury waiver. And so we have to depend on other waiver tools such as the DD waiver and the CCC Plus, which we'll talk about. So these tips really are going to help you figure out a way to well document the case. I'm going to start with tip 4 because this one is quite obvious. If you are a person or work with a person who is already a recipient of the Disabled Adult Child Benefit under Social Security on a parent's record, and that may be the case if that parent is disabled themselves on disability benefits, is retired on Social Security, or is deceased. And so if they already have that benefit, in order to get it, they had to prove that the disability began before age 22. So this one is really key. And even as case managers, I would recommend that you try and determine right from the intake if that individual has this benefit, because then you'll know right off that they would qualify most likely for a DD waiver. So then moving over to tip 1, Erin has talked a lot about the functional deficits that are going to be required within the VIDES screening tool to meet. And what you want to make sure is that your functional limitations, or again, the person you're working with, are well documented across all of the domains listed in the VIDES. And we have discovered 2 really outstanding tools that help you do this in advance. And they're both tools that the Brain Injury Association of Virginia has developed. The first tool is called the BI, or the Brain Injury Checklist. And if you don't mind, I'm going to quickly screen share to show it to you and show you how valuable this can be in preparing. Let's see. Okay, so if we take a look at this, again, it's called a checklist for brain injury problems and symptoms. And if you go down, you'll notice in red, there are 4 categories.
Sorry to interrupt. We're still seeing the tips PowerPoint page. We're not seeing the checklist.
Oh, you're not. Okay, so it's not coming through.
Now we are. Thank you.
Okay, great. So for example, the 4 categories, it allows you to answer questions about our cognition and communication difficulties, which are classic with brain injury. And they get very specific. What are your memory problems? Do you have difficulty concentrating? Is it hard for you to stick with or complete a task? And then other limitations having to do with your psychological difficulties. Are you easily agitated? Are you having a lot of anxiety and depression? And so on. And then physical difficulties. Obviously, many brain injuries result in issues with gait, for example, headaches, seizures, loss of balance, things like that. And you get to indicate what they are and where they are on the severity scale. And then further down, the last category would be your independent living skills. And, are you having trouble managing a checkbook or budgeting money? Can you even count money in a meaningful way? Can you plan things and execute activities that maybe you could do before your injury and you can't do now? So that's basically this checklist. I highly recommend that you spend some time with a family member, somebody who supports you, especially a case manager, and go through this. Because the beauty with this form is twofold. You can use it in preparation for your VIDES application and the screening that will take place, but you can also fill it out and be giving it to your medical and psychological providers, because they need to know the degree to which your cognitive issues, physical issues, and so on are problematic for you in your everyday functioning. And remember, being approved is in many ways all about your functioning. And so critical that you have a tool to do that. The second tool I want to share with you is also a wonderful brain injury tool. And this one is called a quick guide on how to document a brain injury for service eligibility. And this is a brilliant guide that really walks you through the steps to get it all documented, starting with when it happened, and right on it would list a date and an age. And so maybe that would be where the prior to age 22 fact would be shown, and so on. So it goes through, and then I can't click on it here, but there's a credible history interview tool that's used. And again, this is excellent material for case managers to use, particularly at intake when somebody's new, to go through and document these critical aspects to the injury. Okay, so I just wanted to point those out to you and encourage you to use those. And if we can go back to our, let's see, stop. There we go. There we go. All right. Okay, so moving to tip 2, I think, again, it's going to be very important that you make sure the age of the brain injury for this particular waiver, when it occurred, is well documented. That's becoming more obvious as we speak, because the age 22 criteria is so important. And also the functional deficits, which we've talked about. Now, importantly, if the date of injury is remote, so if you are now in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and up, sometimes it can be difficult to document the fact that this occurred maybe 20, 30 years ago. But you can do it. You have to get creative. In some instances, the medical records may be expunged. Although I have discovered most hospitals and even doctors' offices do keep this information. They warehouse it, and you can request it. And it may take a little longer to receive, but those could be critical documents that show you had an emergency room visit, a hospitalization, whatever. It can also show way back when you had an extensive amount of rehabilitation, for example, that went on for weeks and weeks. So that's going to be important. Also, things like maybe a newspaper article that where you were featured with a brain injury, and that would have a date on it. And so that could prove it if you were lacking more medical evidence. Family statements can also be very useful, particularly if you have several family members that can be interviewed and can really attest to when this injury occurred. Like in the statement, they can say it occurred in high school. I remember it because he was a junior. Or, yeah, he was a freshman in college and this terrible accident occurred, or he suffered a stroke. And so those sorts of things can be used. And actually, they're considered pretty credible, though it's not as formal as maybe a medical document. Okay, so moving to tip 3, everybody, most everybody who's had a brain injury, I would say a severe brain injury that would likely qualify for a waiver, has had neuropsychological evaluation. If they haven't, they probably should have it in order to well document the brain injury, because this evidence is considered very objective. They do a lot of IQ testing, and they can determine where maybe the IQ dropped from where it was prior to the injury. And they discuss the psychological condition at the present time. And anyway, they really are very important tools to be able to prove the cognitive, psychological, physical, and independent living limitations. So those are highly recommended. Also, if it's a young person still in school, certainly the triennial evaluations that are done as part of the IEP development plan is very important. And as you know, they have, for example, do a social history, and that might include when this brain injury occurred. Then they develop the IEP, which is going to show what the needs were at the time. This is good for both remote, but also for current. And also carefully phrased physician statements. So just for example, we were trying to help a family prove that their adult son, who was, well into his 40s or so, who had a brain tumor back when he was an adolescent. And the medical records were long gone, but the physician was able to measure the tumor currently and determine when it had started growing likely, and was able to, with a great degree of certitude, indicate that it must have started when he was roughly 13, 14 years old in adolescence. And then the family was able to corroborate that, saying, yeah, he had headaches, he dropped out of school, he couldn't concentrate. So you see how you can piece it together that way. So anyway, those are some tips, and keep them in mind.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So the unfortunate reality of the DD waivers, and we haven't talked about this yet, but it's really important to know, is that they have a waiting list. We talked about there being 3 different DD waivers. It's all one combined waiting list. So it's not like the building independence people are on one waiting list and the community living people are on another. Once you get screened and you're found eligible for a DD waiver, except for in very rare and special cases, you're probably going to end up on this waiting list. And there's over 10,000 people on the waiting list right now. And instead of just having it be sequential, like I was the first person on the waiting list, so I'm the first person to get a Medicaid waiver slot when it becomes available, the state tries to prioritize by level of need those who most need the waiver and those who need the waiver but don't need it as urgently. So I don't know that I'm confident this is not a perfect system. It is flawed, and the reality is that people who are applying for a waiver and are found eligible for it, like most of them probably could benefit from having the waiver right now. But unfortunately, we have to wait every year for the General Assembly to see if they're going to fund new waiver slots. When people pass away on the waiver, their slot becomes available essentially to somebody else. So there can be lengthy waits for some folks. So when you go ahead and apply and you get screened for this waiver and these waivers and you're found eligible, it's possible you'll be found as what they call a priority 1. That's the highest priority that the state has for DD Medicaid waivers. This is often used for people who are currently institutionalized and want to leave the institution and go back to their community. They're considered to have very high need. This is the priority that folks who are maybe being abused or neglected or have like incredibly unstable supports in home that are putting them at risk are going to be in this higher level priority. So the state says these are the people generally who are going to need this waiver within the next year. Slightly below that is the state's priority 2 folks, and the state has roughly determined that these individuals are going to need their DD Medicaid waiver within the next 1 to 5 years. And then finally, they have a priority 3 group of folks on the waiting list who are assessed to be kind of like the lowest need for the waiver. A lot of young kids who live at home and have parents in the home and are getting special education services and have like other supports in place, a lot of times they'll be assessed as a priority 3. Like everyone knows that they're going to get older and they're eventually going to age out of special education, but for right now, the state is considering them a lower priority because there's other supplemental things potentially at play for them. Finally, a little bit separate from this priority grouping on the waiting list is something called emergency slots. So this is actually governed by state regulations. The state has a pool of special, like set aside emergency waiver slots that can be used in exceptional circumstances, like we were talking about abuse and neglect earlier. So maybe somebody has an open Adult Protective Services, APS case going on. They're being abused and neglected and they're very at risk. The state may be able to use one of these emergency slots to get them enrolled in a Medicaid waiver, and then potentially, you know, if it's that community living waiver we were talking about, help move them into like a safer living situation. So Elizabeth, why is it important for people to apply now, even though we know there's a long waiting list for these waivers?
Okay, well, first of all, what's important about applying now as opposed to waiting, even though you may end up on a waiting list, is that you will secure a place on that waiting list. And particularly if one of the triggering events that would switch you from one priority to a higher priority would occur, you would already be on the wait list in order for that new priority to take over. And this can be very important. You know, crises happen, families, change, and things happen. So you want to always be on the waiting list in the event that one of those triggering events would occur. And also, there are other programs, one of which we're going to touch on later, called the REACH program, as an example, that also uses the age 22 cutoff. You have to be up to age 22 to qualify. And so, if you've already shown that you are DD eligible through the DD waiver and being on that wait list, then you've already in effect qualified for REACH, and it would simplify the process for that. REACH services are available when you're in crisis. And so here again, you won't have to go through the often prolonged process of applying. It will already have been done. The other nice program that it does qualify you for while you're on the wait list is the Individual and Family Support Program, the IFSP program. And we're going to touch on that as well too, which involves annual grants that allow you to have some income to spend on various disability-related needs. And that is for people who are on the wait list. And so that's a positive. So also being on the DD wait list can open the door for case management services in some cases. And that's something to consider. Okay.
So we've talked a lot about what it takes to prove that you have a developmental disability, what the actual screening tool looks like when you're going to apply for these services, but we haven't really talked about like the actual nuts and bolts of how and where you apply. So as with most bureaucratic systems, it can be a little bit complicated and vary somewhat from locality to locality, but essentially in Virginia, our community services boards, our CSBs, are the single point of entry into the DD waiver system. So there's a hyperlink on this page where when we send out the materials, if you don't already know what community services board covers your area, you can click on the link and find out which CSB you should be working with. Some of them just serve one locality, some CSBs serve a whole big grouping of counties. It really varies depending on the location you're in. But these CSBs typically have what we would call like a developmental services division or a DD division. So once you find your community services board, you're going to want to find their information on their website, what their phone number is, and call over to them and ask to connect with the DD intake coordinator. They might use slightly different verbiage for that, but it's going to be along those lines. And once you connect with that person, you can schedule an appointment. It's probably going to be in person at the CSB offices where they're going to administer that VIDES we talked about earlier. And if you are a child, of course, you can have a parent or a guardian sit in for that VIDES with you. If you're an adult, you can also have a support person sit in with you. And we actually really encouraged that. It can be really hard and scary when somebody opens up this like 8-page assessment form and starts asking you lots of questions. It can be really nice to have somebody with you, whether it's a family member, a friend, a case manager, somebody can go with you to the CSB for this screening appointment. So they're going to do the VIDES, and it has a little scoring worksheet, and they'll be able to tell from that whether or not you meet the functional criteria for the waiver. It is important to remember, though, as well, that in Virginia, you need to be able to provide a psychological when you're applying for this waiver or shortly after you've gotten the application process started. It's a requirement, I believe, under state regulations to furnish a psychological. Psychologicals can be really hard to come by because they're expensive. Some psychologists have long waiting lists to get in and see them. So you may already have one. If you do, great. Make sure you take a copy of that with you. But if you don't, you can work with the CSB to have one of their psychologists do an assessment of you so that they can have the documentation in place that they need to formalize moving forward with your application. And psychologicals, for those who maybe aren't familiar, it's kind of like the neuropsychological Elizabeth was talking about earlier. You'll usually sit down with somebody and they'll do different types of testing, maybe IQ testing. They'll do a written summary of your different disabilities and diagnoses, talk about the age of onset. Sometimes they forget to put that in the psychological, but that's really key for the developmental disability piece of it. So if you're going in for one new, be sure to ask them to talk about the age that your brain injury occurred. So that documentation will be required to move forward in this process. Sometimes people apply and they're denied. And sometimes people are denied and we as the Disability Law Center, or perhaps you as a case manager, think, how did this happen? This person is clearly eligible for this service. There must have been a mistake somewhere along the way. And these mistakes do happen. Elizabeth and I have both been involved in these cases of trying to help establish eligibility for people where there is just an error, right? Human error happens at the local level when these screenings are happening. Because this is a Medicaid service, there are very robust appeal protections in place. So if you're being denied a Medicaid service, you're supposed to get something in writing about that denial, so you know that you've been denied. And then you also have 30 days to pursue a formal Medicaid appeal. And so those appeals are handled by our state Medicaid agency, which is called DMAS. They have like an online appeal portal that you can sign up for, and we have links here for that. And then they have some more traditional like paper and faxed appeal form processes that you can use. So it doesn't cost you anything to appeal other than your time, of course, which is valuable, but you don't have to have an attorney to appeal. It's something that self-advocates can utilize, family advocates can utilize, and case managers can support people through an appeal as well. Again, it doesn't cost anything. It's really just an opportunity for you to develop new evidence, which you can present during your appeal hearing, and to have like a more neutral person look at the decision that was made and whether or not it was correct. Something else, another strategy, if you're denied and you feel like that was incorrect, or somebody that's supporting you feels like that was incorrect, it's good to know that being denied once doesn't at all prohibit you from applying again. Sometimes that's actually the easiest and most efficient way. Maybe you went in, you applied, and the psychological you presented didn't speak to the date of your disability. You know, it wasn't clearly established in there that you were less than 28, under the age of 22 when you sustained your brain injury. You may say, okay, yeah, that was a proper denial, but I need to just go talk to my psychologist, get an updated record, and then reapply. You can do that at any time. You don't necessarily have to go through the appeal process to do that. As we start to wrap up the DD waiver portion of our presentation, I wanted to mention some wonderful resources that are available as you perhaps are on your journey of learning more about whether or not one of these Medicaid waivers makes sense for you or somebody that you support. So the first resource is called My Life, My Community. It's a website that's maintained by the state. They have individual focused and family focused resources that walk you through the application process, the eligibility process, and lots of other supplemental services and supports that might be available to you as somebody with a developmental disability in Virginia. So that's hyperlinked here, and it's just a wealth of resources and information. Elizabeth mentioned BIAV, the Brain Injury Association of Virginia. They're a wonderful advocacy organization for people with brain injury. We have a similar type of organization in Virginia, specifically for people with developmental disabilities. It's called the ARC of Virginia. So if you're thinking that you might have a developmental disability or somebody you support might have a developmental disability, the ARC is a wonderful resource as well. So they have a state chapter you can contact, and they provide information and referral. And then they also have lots of local chapters around the state. And actually these local chapters can be great at identifying service providers in your area. So once you actually are found eligible for one of these waivers and receive your waiver slot, you may be at a loss as to like who to contact to actually start providing your services. So the local chapters can be a great resource for that. Finally, I've listed the Disability Law Center of Virginia. That's where Elizabeth and I work. People are welcome to call us at any time. We aren't always able to open up a case for full representation, but even in cases where we're not able to provide full representation, we do provide information about what services are available, what your disability rights are with respect to those services. So we provide that direct consultation to people with brain injuries. We oftentimes provide it to their family members if their family members contact us. But we also can do third-party consultations with people like brain injury case managers or other professionals as well. We're going to be shifting gears slightly now to talk about the fourth and final Medicaid waiver that we have in Virginia, which is called the CCC Plus Medicaid waiver, or as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as EDCD Medicaid waiver. So first and foremost, one of the great things about this waiver is there's no waiting list. So if you apply and you're found eligible, it's not like instantaneous. It may take a couple of weeks to get all the paperwork processed, but it's much more instantaneous than a DD waiver. You can go ahead and get on this one right away. We talked earlier about how waivers essentially are an alternative to institutional care. So the institutional care that this waiver is providing is essentially like nursing home type of care. So it's going to be people who have medical nursing needs are going to be eligible for this Medicaid waiver. It's open to children and adults throughout the lifespan. And actually what a lot of people will do, a significant number of people are eligible for both the DD waiver and for the CCC Plus waiver. So some people will apply for the DD waiver, get on the waiting list, and because CCC Plus doesn't have a waiting list, if they apply for this and are also found eligible to start receiving this waiver until a DD waiver slot opens up for them. But you don't have to, of course, have a developmental disability for this waiver, CCC+. You just have to meet this nursing home level of care. The CCC Plus waiver is different also from the other waivers we discussed in that it's a managed care waiver. So in Virginia, we have 6 different Medicaid managed care organizations. So if you are enrolled in the CCC Plus waiver, instead of talking to somebody at the state or in like local government about the services you need, you actually are basically applying for the different services you need and like the hours of support you need through your managed care organization. And they're the ones who are looking at your case and making a determination about whether or not they're going to approve what you've requested. Examples of some of the services that are included with this waiver. There's no residential service, unfortunately, because that is something that a lot of people need. Everybody has to live somewhere, but this waiver does not include a residential component. You have to be able to like live in your own home or live in a family member's home or live with friends or roommates, whatever it may be. And then these service providers come into your home to work with you there. But examples of things that can be provided when those people come in, it could be anything from an environmental modification. So if you have a brain injury and because of your injury, you've had some changes in your mobility, like maybe you use a wheelchair or a walker now, this Medicaid waiver can be utilized for a $5,000 annual allotment to modify your home to make it more accessible. So some people use it to like get a wheelchair ramp installed. It can be used to widen doorways to accommodate your wheelchair, things like that. Private duty nursing is something that's available to people with this waiver, adult day healthcare options, personal emergency response systems, including like remote monitoring is available. So lots of things to think about through CCC+. It's not nearly as comprehensive as the DD waivers, but lots of good supports that can help supplement the natural supports people have in their lives. One of the last services on that last slide was transition services. And I did want to take a minute to talk about these because they have a lot of value for people, probably especially in like kind of that initial period post brain injury. So we know that some people right after their brain injury have significant rehabilitation needs and may end up in like a rehab facility or nursing home. And sometimes people also have behavioral health changes or mental health changes because of their brain injury and might have spend some time in a psychiatric hospital. So transition services are actually available under the CCC Plus waiver and those 3 DD waivers we were talking about earlier. And transition services are like a pool of money if you're already in an institutional setting, like a nursing home. And that could be a nursing home here in Virginia. But if you're a Virginia resident who's been placed out of state, some of our Virginia residents with brain injuries have been placed out of state at a program called Braintree Manor. So if you're out of state or in state, that institutional setting that you're in currently will potentially make you eligible for these transition services, but they can be used for other kinds of institutional transitions as well. So when you're leaving one of those institutional settings and coming back to your home or your community, wherever your home base is going to be, there's an allotment of money that can be used to help, retrofit the home to make it accessible for some of those one-time startup costs, that can be a barrier to getting a new home set up, like, getting furniture or paying some of like your utility deposits to get services started. These transition monies aren't used a lot, but they're a great resource for people who are already institutionalized and ready to come home to their existing home or a new home. And the Centers for Independent Living around Virginia offer transition services. So they're great resources in your local community to talk to. If you have somebody who, is interested in leaving a nursing home and coming back to their local community, talking to the local Center for Independent Living can be a great way to kind of get those services going. We spent a lot of time talking about the VIDES earlier. There's a similar screening tool that's used to determine eligibility for CCC+. It's also multiple pages long. It's a little daunting to think about, but this one is called the Uniform Assessment Instrument, the UAI. So this is a tool that is administered by a community nurse. So somebody that works for the local health department typically is going to be administering this assessment to people who are applying for the waiver. In some cases though, if somebody is just immediately had a brain injury and has been in the hospital and they're in the process of getting discharged back to the community, sometimes hospital social workers are also able to do this screening. So if somebody that is in that situation currently, you could talk to the hospital social worker to see if one has been done or is going to be done before they leave the hospital. We've linked at the bottom here to a CCC Plus self-eligibility tool. So over here on the right, we have a graphic of the first page of the UAI and what that looks like. But there's an organization called Moms in Motion that took this multiple page UAI and converted it into a digital self-paced screening tool on their website. So instead of going through this document and hand tallying everything, sometimes it can be a good option to just go to this self-eligibility tool, plug in your answers and see if you're likely to be eligible for the waiver. Elizabeth, back to you with some tips.
Okay. So these tips are going to be similar to the other tips, except that you're not going to have to prove the injury or condition occurred prior to age 22. So that's not an issue. But we do, again, with tip number 1, recommend that you use the brain injury checklist, compliments of the Brain Injury Association of Virginia, because it so neatly provides you a way to document all of your functional deficits across the domains that actually the uniform assessment instrument also uses. So it almost parallels. And so again, you'd be doing your homework to get this checklist filled out, and then you know how to answer the screening questions when they're there in your home. And once again, ensuring all functional limitations that you have and care needs are well documented. You really have to sort of do an inventory, and that's why I think this checklist is so helpful. But these things also need to be documented in your medical and psychological record, because in addition to the UAI, I believe they do collect some records as well, and everything needs to corroborate. Also important to accurately report these limitations to your doctors and psychologists and therapists. The last tip here is kind of a classic thing that we recommend when filling out function forms and the like, or if you're in a live situation where people are asking you questions about how you function. You really have to think of it as your worst day. That's the day you're reporting on, because if you even had one of those worst days a week, that could very well qualify you. And also, if you're working in tandem with a person with a brain injury who you suspect isn't providing information that is as accurate maybe as you think the situation is, you can add some information, not to dispute the person, but rather to provide your additional perspective. This could be true with things like self-care and chores. The individual with brain injury may have sort of an inflated sense of their ability to do those things. And so, you would want to be able to qualify that. Like when I saw you in your home last week, I noticed that you had difficulty with toileting, or I noticed you are having some issues with incontinence, or I noticed that you really aren't eating 3 square meals a day, and so probably need help in that vein as well. So it's really more to clarify. Okay, so those are my tips on accessing CCC Plus.
Such an important reminder. And I think it's hard for a lot of us who maybe have like a social work orientation or other kinds of training or life experiences. We're taught very much to take a person first and strengths-based approach to talking about people that we support. The reality, though, is this is not the time to talk about strengths. It just isn't, unfortunately. There are other ways, once you have the services in place, to build upon those strengths, to build a good care plan and support system. This is not the time for that. And I think I forgot to mention earlier, so I'm sorry, I'm piggybacking on your slide, Elizabeth. One of the key requirements to be found eligible for this waiver, CCC Plus, is something they call being at risk of placement in a nursing home. So the way this is often presented when the screening is happening is, oh, like, are you going to send your loved one to a nursing home? Or, oh, do you think you need to go to a nursing home? And a lot of families are horrified by that. And they say, no, like, no, I would never send my loved one to a nursing home. Or the individual may say, like, no, I would never go willingly to a nursing home. The question is confusing because I think some people are afraid that if they say yes, that, you know, somebody's going to come in and immediately take them to a nursing home, but that's not really what's being asked. What's being asked is, like, if you strip all these natural supports that you have away from yourself or from your loved one, right? Like if you're getting informal supports from a parent or a family friend and that person becomes incapacitated or passes away and you have nobody left to help with these things, might you then have to go into a nursing home? Not that you're going to, like, willingly, but might you have to? And that's really more like what the question is getting at. It's a tricky question to navigate. And I wish that we didn't have to have that as part of the screening, but it is unfortunately a piece of what they look at right now.
Yeah, and after all this, what you're trying to prove is that you need that level of care without all of the supports in place.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you decide that you want to apply for a CCC Plus waiver, if you are already receiving CCC Plus healthcare, some people on Medicaid in Virginia just get the healthcare services through CCC Plus. You'll have somebody called a care coordinator. Your mileage really varies with these folks, but if you have a care coordinator and can get in touch with them, you can tell that person, hey, I think I need this waiver. Can you help me get the screening and application process going? And they should help you with that. They might not always help you with that, but they should. So that's a good place to start. If you're not currently connected with a CCC Plus MCO, or your MCO is being unresponsive to you, you can also apply at the local level. So the screening for this waiver is handled by your local Department of Social Services and your local Department of Health. And at the local level, there's like 120 different local departments of social services. And so some of them have great websites with lots of information available and some don't. But essentially, you're going to want to call up these local agencies and say, I need to do a long-term care screening. And hopefully that'll get you to the right person. It doesn't always, just to be very honest with you guys, sometimes people end up falling through the cracks. And so if you're having trouble with your local department, I would say definitely call the LCV. We can help get you connected with the right people. But you're going to want to start at the local level at least to do the screening. So social services is going to be responsible for the financial screening part of this. And your local Department of Health, that community health nurse we were talking about, will do the actual UAI assessment with you. Typically in your home during the pandemic. Occasionally they've done them like virtually or by telehealth. But in person in the home is usually actually a better way to really convey and communicate what your needs are.
Erin, we have a quick question in this context. Somebody's asking, can a certified community health worker do the UAI?
Well, I mean, anybody could do the UAI, especially as a preparation to go through it and kind of self-score. In this context, for this waiver, though, no, you're going to need to go through your local Department of Health and Social Services. Like, they will have somebody on staff that is responsible for doing the screenings for this waiver specifically.
Thank you.
So it's important to remember, I'll go back briefly just to highlight this last bullet. Your local department cannot deny you one of these screenings, even if they think they know you from the grocery store, from work, from church, whatever it is. And they think, oh no, there's no way Erin is eligible for this. They are not allowed to deny you a screening. And if they do, please try and get something in writing from them to that effect. They should not be doing it, which isn't to say again that it doesn't ever happen, but they're not allowed to deny you that screening. So we encourage that people get something in writing if they are being denied the opportunity to even have the screening, because you get robust appeal rights at that point. And similarly, if you go through the screening and they say you're not eligible and you really feel like, no, like I'm eligible, or this person I'm supporting is eligible, there are formal appeal processes. They're exactly the same as the DD appeal processes we discussed earlier. So it's a formal process, but it doesn't require an attorney. It doesn't cost you anything to file one of these appeals. And you have multiple ways, whether it's through the online portal or through mail or fax, to go about the appeal process. It's just important to remember to get it started within that 30-day window after the denial occurs. But even if you happen to miss that 30-day window, or you reflect on what's just happened and you think maybe I'm not eligible right now, but 6 months from now, a year from now, you have a fall and you break a hip and you have like additional mobility support needs or medical nursing needs, you can, just like with the DD waiver, you can always apply for this one again, always. So you're never precluded. As long as you're in Virginia, you can always go ahead and apply, and potentially with, as Elizabeth has shared, more robust documentation from your medical providers or others to demonstrate why you think you're eligible for this waiver. A few resources that are available, free resources that are available in Virginia for people who need help learning about or navigating the CCC Plus waiver process. One of the best ones, one of our favorite ones, one of the ones that we collaborate with all the time is actually a state agency. So within the Office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, there's a team of advocates who are specially trained in CCC Plus services. So they have great contacts at the state Medicaid agency. They have great contacts at all of the MCOs. So if you're being denied, you think you need help with an appeal and don't know where to go, your care coordinator that you already have is not responding to you, any of that stuff, if it's happening, these are the people to talk to. Their services are free, and they really are the true experts on CCC Plus in Virginia. I mentioned earlier Moms in Motion. They're a service facilitation agency for Medicaid waivers, but they happen to have just a very robust website with lots of resources available. So you can click on this link and read about the CCC Plus waiver. You can do that DIY self-assessment tool we talked about earlier. All that stuff is available for free on their website. And then finally, again, please consider the Disability Law Center resource. If you're starting this process and reach a roadblock or otherwise don't know how to proceed, want information about your appeal rights, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to connect you with the appropriate subject matter expert here in the office. All right, Elizabeth, back to you.
Okay, so this is a very important slide concerning individuals who have waivers and are turning 18. The reason this is important is because when you're a child and have waivers, you do not have to have SSI, the Supplemental Security Income Cash Benefit from Social Security. However, to maintain your Medicaid waivers after the age of 18, you do need to have SSI in place. So you would apply for the SSI at age 18 if you don't have that SSI in place as a child. And so it's important, though, to know that you have about a year to get the SSI in place. And during that time, your Medicaid waiver is supposed to be protected. The way this happens is that in about the fourth quarter of your 17th year, just proceeding when you turn 18, Medicaid will conduct what's called a Medicaid disability determination. It's very like and very similar to an SSI application, But it's with the precise purpose of preserving your Medicaid so that you can preserve your waivers while you undergo the SSI application. And that is typically, approved, and then it would protect you for up to a year, and presumably the SSI application would be decided by them. If you have SSI already as a child, then you'll undergo what's called an age 18 redetermination. And then in that process, you will eventually, hopefully, become approved as an adult with SSI, and that will preserve those waivers. So if you're having trouble accessing or maintaining Social Security or the SSI benefit to keep your Medicaid, we can do some guidance around that, perhaps. So you want to reach out to DLCV. But it's important for case managers in particular to know this juncture could be occurring, and to make sure that the Medicaid disability determination is taking place on time. Department of Social Services, I think, usually issues the letter to get that ball rolling, and the family would have to provide documentation. So that's how you know it's occurring. If it doesn't seem to be occurring around the time they turn 18, you want to reach out to Department of Social Services and make sure that it happens, okay? Because you do not want the child, once they turn an adult, to lose those waiver services.
Such an excellent point, Elizabeth, especially because we know CCC Plus does not have a waiting list, right? So if there happens to be a gap in coverage, you lose your waiver, it's not that difficult most of the time to get it back. However, the DD waivers have that waiting list. And if you lose your waiver spot, I think it's typically like if you haven't used a waiver service in the last 30 days or so, some of that's been on pause during the pandemic, you'll be disenrolled, and they'll essentially assign your waiver slot to somebody else. So this is a hugely important thing for folks to be paying attention to around the age of 18. We're nearing the end of our presentation. We want to have lots of time for question and answer in case folks want to dive a little bit deeper into any of these issues. But before we kind of wrap things up, we wanted to talk about some supplemental services. So this next little set of services we're going to touch on, we're going to do very quickly and briefly. They are not waiver services, but they're nice adjuncts to or supplements to waiver services, or for people who are on the waiting list waiting for a slot to open up. Elizabeth mentioned earlier, we have something in Virginia called the Individual and Family Support Program, IFSP. This is not funded by Medicaid. It is funded by state general funds, and it's for people with developmental disabilities who are on that waiting list we talked about, right? Some people are on that waiting list and unfortunately are on it for years. So every year there's a pool of money that the state opens up for applications where you yourself, if you are on the waiting list, or a family member, anybody can really help you apply for these funds. You can be approved annually for up to $1,000 to pay for a lot of different things, actually. And on my next slide, I'm going to show you some of the different things that you can use these IFSP funds for. And some of these are great because they're things you would never get funded under a Medicaid waiver, but are hugely important to a lot of people with disabilities. So one that comes up for Elizabeth and I a lot, right, when people call us, are legal fees for setting up a special needs trust. We talked about those earlier. Legal fees for writing up a POA, a power of attorney document. These funds can be used for something like that. It can be used for fencing if somebody has a history of like elopement or wandering risks, anything like that. You can use some of the funding potentially to have a fence installed to help with safety at the home. Another one I wanted to highlight just because it seems really timely and relevant right now. Some people use these funds to pay for summer camps. And in Virginia, some of you might know, we have a brain injury specific summer camp actually called Camp Bruce McCoy. So that could be something while somebody's waiting for a slot to open up. Maybe it's really important for their socialization and personal enrichment to take part in something like that. So these funds could be used for that as well. This is not an exhaustive list. When you get the PowerPoint, there'll be a link that can take you to a fact sheet that basically goes through like everything conceivable that could be used with these funds. And there's a lot of flexibility, thankfully, there. This next service is only going to be applicable for people under the age of 21. So our younger folks, children, young adults are eligible for early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment if they are receiving Medicaid, any type of Medicaid, like Medicaid healthcare coverage. They're eligible for EPSDT. EPSDT is a mandatory Medicaid benefit. So every state in the United States that participates in Medicaid has to offer EPSDT. It was created many decades ago because Congress recognized that a lot of children were sustaining injuries or coming down with illnesses that were impacting their ability later on in life to live on their own or to take up military service or to maintain employment. And they thought it was important that we make sure that children during that critical development stage had access to more robust services to prevent further worsening of symptoms, to fully remediate the effects of a disability or a diagnosis. So as long as something is medically necessary and somebody is already receiving Medicaid benefits, EPSDT can be like a golden ticket. It can be a little tricky to navigate. We're not going to go into all the ins and outs of that now because it could be a whole separate webinar. But please know that for Medicaid beneficiaries up through the last day of their 20th year, EPSDT could be a huge game changer. It can pay for rehabilitative services, communication supports, assistive technology, all kinds of things. Elizabeth mentioned earlier a program called REACH. That's really the way it's referred to. You pretty much never hear anybody say the Regional Education Assessment Crisis Habilitation Program, but that is what REACH stands for. This is a 24/7 statewide crisis prevention, stabilization, and response service. This has been in place in Virginia for about the last 10 years or so. It's had some growing pains. It doesn't always work as well as I think individuals and families would hope. However, it is a service that's available. There's a lot of funding being poured into this right now. And we encourage people who are having either a current psychiatric crisis or behavioral health challenges, or we anticipate maybe they have cyclical behavioral health challenges and something might come up for them in the near future, to get connected with REACH. The only eligibility requirement for REACH is that you have a developmental disability. You don't have to have Medicaid. You don't even have to be on the Medicaid waiver waiting list that we were talking about earlier. You just have to be able to establish that you have a developmental disability. So this is hugely important for many individuals who maybe have too many resources that are never going to be Medicaid eligible. They can still take advantage of these REACH services if they need those more intensive behavioral health supports. They offer both in-home crisis response, but then they also have some out-of-home crisis stabilization units that you can go to if needed. And all of these services are free. You should not be charged for REACH services ever. If you have Medicaid, they can bill Medicaid for those services, but you should not personally receive a bill for them. Elizabeth, I think this one was for you.
Sure. More tips. Now the tips here are pretty straightforward. As Erin indicated, you do not have to have a developmental disability waiver in place in order to qualify for REACH services, although as indicated earlier, it could speed up REACH services if you are already DD eligible. And if a person with a brain injury that did occur before age 22 has or is at risk of behavioral health issues, it's important to establish their DD status early, again, to speed up the crisis services if they're needed. You don't want to be trying to do those in the moment. So actually, we encourage case managers, for example, to go through the process of getting people made eligible for DD, particularly those that may have these at-risk behaviors that are going to qualify them for REACH. And so, but again, you could be on the receiving a disabled adult child benefit, and that would prove DD quickly. You could have good neuropsychological or simply psychological evaluations that would prove that quickly. And school records can often prove it quickly. So have those at hand, particularly if you're sensing that this is going to become a problem. The key really is to have the documentation in place before the crisis occurs.
The final program we wanted to touch on today is called PACE. This is another one where you don't really hear it referred to by its full name, which is the Program of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly. It's usually just called PACE. PACE is an interesting program. It's for people aged 55 and older. A lot of people who receive PACE are actually eligible for both Medicare and Medicaid, though if you don't have Medicaid and just have Medicare, you can still potentially access PACE services. So PACE, just like the CCC Plus waiver, is an alternative to nursing home level of care. So it's that same UAI we were talking about. It's that same screening tool that's done to see if you're eligible for PACE services. And a good way to think about PACE is kind of like it being a health home, if you guys have ever heard that term. So there's a component of it that's home-based, but a bigger component of it really is center-based. So they have these PACE centers, like an office complex where you have medical professionals on staff, you have social workers, you have MDs, you have nurses, all these people working together. And when you're enrolled in PACE, they're basically managing every aspect of your care. And that can be really important, well, for anyone, but especially as we get older, if we have more needs due to our disabilities or like co-occurring health issues, having this central program that can kind of coordinate all of that for you can be really helpful to keeping you out of a nursing home and keeping you at home in your own setting on your own or with your family. Just like with the brain injury case management we have in Virginia right now, unfortunately, we do not have PACE everywhere. We have pretty good PACE coverage in Virginia, but it's not in every locality yet. So there's a link here if you're interested to see if PACE is available where you live or where a loved one lives. You can click on that later to do some research and see. And if there is a program and you're interested in applying, you actually just apply directly through that PACE program. They can walk you through how to do that. Examples of some of the services, again, I already talked about the healthcare that can be provided through PACE, but just like some of the waiver services, you can get home modifications made, right? Maybe having grab bars installed in your shower to help make that a little safer for you. They're going to coordinate your prescription drug care, offer home healthcare services, adult daycare, transportation. A lot of things are available through PACE if that's a service that you want to explore. We're going to move over to Q&A soon, but I wanted to mention something that has been in the back of my mind as we've been doing this presentation. You know, these Medicaid waivers that we've talked about today and the other supplemental services are available. In a lot of cases, they're free or low cost, and we encourage people, if they think they're eligible, to take advantage of them. The reality is during the pandemic, however, that the disability service system has been in a crisis. A lot of people have been leaving the workforce. You know, reimbursement rates have been historically very low. And some people get a Medicaid waiver and then struggle, even though they have the waiver, to find the services and supports that they need to actually come in and provide the care that they want. So I don't want to like sell waivers as being this like panacea that's going to take care of like all of the issues that somebody might have going on in their life. We still encourage people to apply for them, enroll in them if they can, but there may be a need for continued advocacy over the years to make sure that the state holds up their end of providing the care that they're saying they're going to give you through one of these waivers. Elizabeth, any parting or final words from you before we turn it over to Q&A?
Yeah, actually, no, we do have a couple of key Q&A questions, so I'd like to move to them right away. One of our case managers indicated that the process can take a while. And I believe she's referring to the CCC Plus waiver. We can clarify that. She says, I just had a consumer that was screened in January and it took 6 months to get waiver services started. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. This is actually a very interesting discussion that's been happening nationally and in Virginia with some of the advocates that do this kind of work. So there's this thing called institutional bias in Medicaid, right? If you have been found to need nursing home level of care, you are eligible to go to a nursing home, but you're also eligible for this CCC Plus waiver. The bias occurs in that you can essentially move to a nursing home tomorrow, right? As soon as you can find one that has an open bed, you can go. But it does often drag on for a really long time on the community side of things. So people call this a bias because even though it's the same, you have the same level of need, it's actually saving the state a lot of money often to get the waiver rather than go into an institutional setting. It's just not as efficient and there aren't enough protections in place. Some states through like the legislative process or the regulatory process have created much clearer timelines, essentially, like at their state level. If somebody applies for this community-based alternative to institutional care, the screening needs to happen within this many days and the services need to actually start within this many days. In Virginia, it's kind of wishy-washy right now. We've been having some discussions with national advocacy partners around this because our hope is to get more rigid timelines in place for the community side of things, because the reality is 6 months is a long time to wait if you've already been assessed, and you may end up in a nursing home in those months while you're waiting for the community care to start. So it's a real issue. And I would definitely say if this happens to anybody on this call where you've started the process and it seems to be taking much longer than it should, please reach out to DLCV, reach out to those CCC Plus advocates that we talked about that work at the state, as there might be things we can do to kind of push this along and to make it a little bit more efficient.
Great, thank you, Erin. And then the next question appears to be from a family member saying, my daughter has a DD waiver, but the CSB is consistently unresponsive to her needs as a survivor of a severe TBI. I have reached out to DLCV, the Human Rights Commission, and various county and state agencies, etc. I am about to turn 80 with health issues that sooner or later will make it impossible to physically support her. Who do we turn to? The CSB refuses to communicate with me, preferring to engage with her sister who lives in Berlin and says yes to anything that will not require her to do anything. Oh boy.
Yeah, this is something that definitely comes up as well. So we were talking about earlier how the CSB is the single point of entry into the DD waiver system. And so what often happens, and it sounds like what's happened with this family, is once you're found eligible for a waiver and a slot is actually assigned to you, the typical default is that you're going to get your case management. So the person who's supposed to coordinate all of your care, make sure your hours are approved, all of that. It's typically going to default to that CSB you did your screening with. And sometimes people will try multiple case managers in a department. They'll try doing, like what this family member was saying, filing more formal complaints, and it just still feels like they're hitting roadblock after roadblock. And sometimes what we encourage people to do in those cases, you actually under Medicaid have the right to get your case management elsewhere. So the way that the state accomplishes this right now is the CSBs contract sometimes with centers for independent living. So that'd be one thing to look into in your area. Is there a center for independent living locally that is able to provide the DD case management to see if you get better results with an agency like that? And sometimes we've advocated for people to just have their case completely transferred to a different CSB altogether. And sometimes just having that change in relationships and dynamics can be the fresh start that people need. Though I of course understand that it's frustrating. We shouldn't have to like work that hard, right, to get the services that we're already entitled to. But those are some of the options that we help people navigate when these issues arise.
Okay, this is a good time to ask. Are there any other questions that you'd like to ask? If you'd like to go ahead and put them in the chat box. Oh, here's one. Does CCC Plus waiver of an adult with disabilities has to be a U.S. citizen?
Okay, does the person who's receiving the Medicaid waiver have to be a citizen of the United States? Um, so they'd have to be Medicaid eligible, and there's at the federal level. So at the state level, we used to have this thing called a 5-year rule, where if you had like legally come to the United States and like you had the proper visas in place or whatever you needed to come here, and you've been here for 5 years, at that point you could apply for Medicaid, I believe. And the state a couple of years ago got rid of that requirement, but there's still, I think, a 5-year rule at the federal level. I'd want to double check that. I'm pretty sure that's still in place. So even though Virginia's gotten rid of that prohibition, at the federal level, I think that's still in place. So the individual may have to reside here if they haven't already a certain number of years before they can enroll in Medicaid. I will also say that
I'm sorry, he does say his son has Medicaid, if that changes the scenario. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, if they already have Medicaid, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
They can apply for the waiver. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Yeah. And so more specifically, my son had DD waiver, lost at 18 due to pause in immigration, and now has got Medicaid again, and immigration is sure to be processed.
Okay, great. Yes. Well, I would
Yeah.
definitely go ahead and, get the screening process moving. And like we talked about earlier, if you think they're eligible potentially for both DD and CCC plus, sometimes it's good to apply for both, because we know that CCC plus can start more immediately than a DD slot. Potentially you might be on the waiting list for a while with that one.
Okay. I believe that this is the previous questioner says, I have tried to have her services moved to Fairfax, but have been told that is no longer possible. I tried to get her case manager services moved to the ARC, but they have no slots. What does it mean that that the SIL can take over? Do you mean ECNV, Independent Center of Northern Virginia, I presume?
Yeah, so some of the SILs, not all of them, but some of them offer DD case management. The one that immediately comes to mind for me is the SIL in Norfolk. I know they do a lot of DD case management, but it certainly would be worth asking if you have a good relationship with or just want to explore the Independent Center in Northern Virginia to see if they provide case management. And as far as like the refusal from the state, I guess, to move over to Fairfax as an alternative case management provider, I think we have some good escalation contacts at DVHDS that we could share with you if you wanted to follow up with us, because they're not allowed to just say, well, this is the one option. Like the CSB in your area is the one option. You can't go anywhere else. Like under federal Medicaid requirements, you're supposed to have choice in case management. So you can either switch case managers within, or if you want to go to an external agency, go to an external agency. So the answer shouldn't be like, just no, you have to stay where you're at because nothing else is available. So I think we have some good contacts we could connect you with at the state for that.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, and this looks like a good time to wrap up. Erin and I want to thank you for your attention today. This is a lot of material to plow through. You'll notice our slides didn't really track perfectly with what we were talking about because we didn't want to be reading our slides, but you will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint in the near future, and we'll probably wait for the recording to be edited before we send those out together. Along with the evaluation, and we do certainly request that you give us some feedback on this so that we can continue to do it. Erin has put up our Connect with Us slide, and I want to remind you all, if you're not aware of this, but we offer a very robust information and referral service using our subject matter experts at DLCV, of which we have many. And so what I encourage you to do is to call on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You can do this as an individual with a disability, as a person who supports somebody, either as a family member, perhaps, or a professional. And you talk about what the needs are. We have an intake specialist or an advocate on duty who will put that into our system, and it'll be assigned to the subject matter expert for some quite refined information referral. And then, as Erin suggested, if we have a way to incorporate it into a something involving more advocacy services, that would be determined at that time. So just think of us as a resource along with the many other resources we have mentioned in the past. This has been a great opportunity to share all this information with you. We also have a web page on traumatic brain injury. It's TBI, of course, it includes acquired brain injury. And that's at www.dlcv.org/TBI. And that will get you to some great information about what's available across Virginia. A lot of the systemic advocacy efforts that have been occurring, there are some reports, and likewise, it will be useful to you as well. So again, thank you for attending, and we hope this has been helpful.